how he and Boy were getting along, so it really kept us up to date with what was happening.
The news from Cora in the 2 months since they left was that Boy and Christian had become inseparable. They had changed from enemies to friends and would disappear away from the compound for days at a time. An African lion teaching the European youngster the ways of the wild. But Cora was not just home to Boy and Christian, it was also home to rival lions, and this made life fraught with danger.
Boy and Christian, being males, were always going to have trouble with the wild lions. They were never going to just let them carve their own territory out in their territory.
In the 8 months since John and Ace had left, Christian's pride had been trying to establish their territory. But then, a major setback. A vicious clash with the rival lions left Boy seriously injured. Despite George's care, the debilitating attack had far-reaching results. Boy's temperament changed, and he became a real threat to humans. On June 6, 1971, Boy returned to the compound where George and his staff, including his assistant Stanley, lived. Outside the compound, Stanley was attacked by Boy.
The first thing that was heard was this shrieking and roaring and shrieking from a person and roaring from an animal. George grabbed his gun and saw Stanley in Boy's mouth. And George had no alternative but to shoot Boy. And Stanley actually died too from his wounds. He never recovered. So it was a double and terrible tragedy.
It was just devastating news. It became international news about George Adamson's tame lions, the danger of his work rather than the good aspects of his work.
The death of Stanley was a tragedy, a loss to his family and to George. With Boy's death, Christian had lost his best friend. He would sit by Boy's grave for hours on end. Now the only male in the Cora Pride, he was on his own. Tony Fitzjohn, a 25-year-old with a love of wildlife, joined George Adamson at Cora. He recognised Christian's unhappiness.
He did miss Boy. It did add to his fear level. Boy wasn't there anymore. It was sort of, how do I cope now? What do I do? You know, why is he gone? Where's he gone? And there's always that period of worry and uncertainty, non-understanding of why someone suddenly disappeared. But they get themselves together pretty quickly and have to, you know, sort of create their own lives.
Boy's death and Christian's loneliness worried John and Ace. After a year apart from him, they decided it was time to return to Africa. Like family, they wanted to give Christian support, but they knew that things would be different this time.
We weren't sure of our reception this time. We always thought anything could happen. It was very dangerous. It was the wilds of Africa.
After an anxious day in the compound, Ace and John walked onto Christian's territory. George might be welcome here, but Ace and John were almost strangers. They hadn't seen Christian in a year. If he perceived them as unwelcome guests, there could be trouble.
George appeared on the top of the hill, I suppose about 100 metres away from us, with Christian. Christian ambled down another 10 or 15 metres and had a very long, hard look at us.
You could just see him assessing what was going on. kept walking slowly, slowly down towards us.
And I think that was the point where we actually couldn't bear it any longer and actually called out his name.
And at that moment, the pace picks up. And he was just so excited. And of course we were. I mean, imagine how excited we were.
It was just an incredible reunion. Whether we were human or he was animal was sort of irrelevant.
Christian's acceptance of John and Ace was mirrored by the lionesses, brought to Cora 3 months earlier to develop the pride. They too welcomed the newcomers.
Suddenly, we were aware that those 2 lionesses were with us as well, and they were greeting us and pushing and shoving.
We had these lions we didn't know milling around us, Christian jumping up on us, George beaming. It was really quite sort of euphoric. It's actually quite hard to find the words for it. Everyone, lions, humans, all felt we'd shared something very, very special. So it was very emotional for all of us, and we knew we'd been part of or witnessed something quite extraordinary.
Christian's London family relaxed with his African family, the lionesses and an orphaned cub. Ace and John were confident that Christian had found his place in Africa.
To leave him the second time was easier, really, because you knew he was such a success. He had a wonderful relationship with George. He obviously had a powerful relationship with the lionesses. And he was huge.
Ace and John went back to London reassured about Christian's future as an African lion. But a growing lion reaching maturity could be a serious threat to those around him.
George told us later, adolescence was the most dangerous time for lions. That's when he was most wary of them. Christian, at around this time, had in fact knocked Tony to the ground.
He flattened me, put my head in his mouth, rolled over on his back and proceeded to kick me with his back legs. And then he thought that was a lot of fun, so then he shook me a bit and then he dropped me. And I was getting quite scared. He was this huge, great guy just playing with me like a rag doll. And so he came straight for me, so I punched him straight in the nose. And it worked, and he veered off. It must have been like a tack to him, you know, because they're so tough. Christian came up a few minutes later, like, you know, saying hello and being friendly, and, you know, and I refused to talk to him for the rest of the day. He never did it again, but every now and then I get the look. And I'm saying, you do that again, you said. And he goes, oh, not me, you know, and it was great.
Ace and John had wanted Christian to grow up in Africa, to find his place in the wild. They continued to seek out information about his life on the other side of the world.
George had been keeping us up to date with what was happening, and that he'd been disappearing for months on end, and was obviously looking to establish his own territory further away from Cora.
About a year later, we thought it would be nice to go again, just to see how he was getting on.
In June 1972, John and Ace made the 5,000-kilometre journey back to Kenya, hoping to see their 3-year-old lion again.
George warned us that he mightn't even come to camp.